joined the Army in 1979. He's been deployed in Bougainville. He's been involved in as a Colonel of Operations in the Headquarters International Force for East Timor. He's been the commander of the Australian Defence Forces, and he's led a review into Australia's joint education and training system, an absolutely vital role. In June 2011, he assumed his current position as Chief of the Army, and he has worked with his team and with his leadership with the team from the Australian Human Rights Commission, led by Elizabeth Broderick, as I've mentioned, in a collaborative work to ensure that the culture embraces women and the role that they can play in our defence forces. And I believe I'm right in saying that recently the numbers of women joining the Australian Defence Force is increasing.
Thank you very much for those very kind words, and ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to be here. I have, during the 3 years of my tenure as your Chief of Army, so far done a great deal with the Human Rights Commission, primarily of course Liz Broderick and her team, but I have spoken here on 2 previous occasions, and when the opportunity was given to me to come and talk about Anzac, what we'll be fighting for, it was an invitation that I just couldn't pass up. You know, the theme of the conference is Anzac spirit and human rights in peace and war, and I think the first point I'd like to make is that that can be a fraught and contested topic at any time. But with the approach of the centenary of the Great War and the 100th anniversary of the landings at Gallipoli next year, this has thrust Anzac and what it ought to mean to us into the foreground of public debate. And that may be a very good thing. I think Anzac looms large in the Australian psyche. For better or for worse, and in this room I suspect that there are some who incline to worse, the Anzac story has become one of the dominant National Foundation myths. Now, I choose the term myth deliberately. Myths perform vital roles in communities from tribes all the way through to nations. The best of them contain enough truth to confer longevity, if not immortality. Likewise, the best of them are a summons to live out noble, universal human values. And I think that Anzac has that potential. But I sense that in the coming year, there will be too little reflection on the deep significance of Anzac and its place, and in its place there will be an unedifying arm wrestle to claim ownership of it to the exclusion of one's ideological opponents. And that, in my view, would be a great shame. If Anzac is to fulfil its mythical role effectively, we must seek to interpret it in an expansive way so that Australians can draw inspiration from it. I hope it becomes a beacon to inspire rather than a club with which to beat dissenters into conformity. Now, for good reasons, chiefs of the Australian Army scrupulously avoid partisan political disputes. Indeed, one reason that human rights are so secure in this country is that our military does not actively engage in politics. Political generals and absolutism go hand in hand. So while sincerely hoping that the national conversation about Anzac is civil and informative, I have to avoid taking partisan positions in any debate. I have the honour to lead one of our oldest, most revered and well-funded public institutions. In the interest of accountability and transparency, the public deserve to hear from me on occasions, albeit sparingly, on how their funds are being spent and what steps I'm taking to ensure that their sons and daughters are equipped to survive in dire peril. On occasions I've spoken in public about what the changing character of war and the shifting global balance imply for the structure of your defence force. However, opportunities such as the one that has been presented to me today are most welcome. Again, some of you may think that the Chief of Army may know something about Anzac but precious little about human rights. Hopefully I may have gone some way to disabusing you of that notion over the past couple of years. With the support and advice of people of influence such as Elizabeth Broderick, I believe that we are making enormous improvements to the environment in which our people serve. Military life by its very nature, demands some curtailment of one's human rights. Preparation for war is a demanding and harsh business, but training is never a guise for abuse, especially sexual assault. And insofar as anyone seeks to invoke some legendary digger myth, allegedly derived from Anzac, to justify degrading their colleagues, they have no place in the army. And I trust I've made that abundantly clear during my tenure. While I have sought to stamp out abuse and bullying disguised as training, I have not done it in pursuit of any human rights accolades. I am merely doing my job, though most assuredly with genuine conviction. Moreover, every decision that I have made to enhance the role of women in army and to eliminate unacceptable discrimination against women has been taken with a professional eye to improve capability. I'm not a crusader, though if I've done some good in seeking to improve operational effectiveness of the Australian Army, then I am of course both proud and delighted. Now, with that caveat firmly in place, I believe that I come to debates on human rights with what equity lawyers would call clean hands. As a professional soldier, I tend towards pessimism about the innate human proclivity for violence. I am also a foreign policy realist. The Wilsonian moment that may have come with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the removal of Slobodan Milosevic proved to be all too fleeting. As recent events in Ukraine and in Syria amply demonstrate, those who wish for peace still need to prepare for war. Or as George Orwell so eloquently put it, we sleep safe in our beds at night because rough men stand vigil in the dark ready to visit violence on those who would do us harm. And while that is a statement that I have changed by way of paraphrase to include tough men and women rather than rough men, I believe that it holds as true in 2014 as it did for Orwell in 1930. What does this all have to do with Anzac? Well, I think quite a lot. Over the next year, a host of people will ask why we fought at Gallipoli. If the press commentary of the past few days is any guide, some observations will contain a degree of rancour, while others will tend to invoke a level of nationalistic sentimentality, regardless of the ideological view of those espousing it. I trust you won't accuse me of ducking the issue when I say that I have little patience for either extreme. Some regard any criticism of the Anzac as a form of treason. This is actually immature and unhelpful. The Anzacs justifiably will continue to be revered, but those who use their service to bludgeon conformity to a narrow ideal of what an Australian, and particularly an Australian soldier, should be, deliver harm, not homage, to Anzac. If Anzac is our most potent national myth, and I believe it is, then it must be inclusive and expansive. It must offer intangible and universal values to all Australians. Fortunately, I believe it is capacious enough to achieve this. The most pervasive distortion about what really happened in Turkey in 1915 is that the Aussie bloke is a natural soldier. That notion is incredibly unhelpful to those who are responsible for raising, training and sustaining credible military forces in 2014. War is brutal, nasty business. Hobbesian in every regard except for any propensity to be short. Creating and developing small teams that are capable of withstanding the shock of battle and which in turn can continue to fight effectively is demanding, unglamorous and a dangerous business. The myth of the gifted amateur is the most dangerous which the romantics propagate. In simple terms, it would be the equivalent of every cricket coach telling their kids that it was Doug Walter's ability to drink and smoke that made him a great batsman. The reality is that our elite sportsmen and women live aesthetic lives, yet there is a tendency to focus on the blokey ladder to the exclusion of all other forms of endeavour. Now, lest I be misinterpreted, be assured that I, like every single Australian soldier, am fiercely proud of Anzac. We are all acutely aware that we wear the same distinctive slouch hat, and Rising Sun badge immortalised by those men of 1915. It's a great honour, and it subtly defines our values of courage, initiative, respect and teamwork. Moreover, every nation and every army needs a foundation myth from which to draw resilience and a sense of identity. Ours is a noble one. It venerates courage, self-sacrifice, with daring tempered with stoicism. These are innate human values, but I can assure you that in today's army, they are not the exclusive province of lantern-jawed country boys. Every Australian soldier aspires to them, men and women alike, as well as those whose forebears were in the Australian Imperial Force and those whose parents were not born here in this country. Again, some of the more bellicose enforcers of conformity to the myth of the hard-drinking larrikin berate serious military historians for questioning combat performance. But those comforted by fairy tales in lieu of history miss the vital point that the Australian Imperial Force was an adaptive learning organisation which became increasingly professional and lethal over the duration of the war. Our mastery of combined arms warfare reached its apotheosis under Monash in the battles of 1918, 4 years after Gallipoli. The Anzac landing was not our finest hour, and that is not a slur on the bravery or elan of those who stormed ashore on that fateful morning. It's merely a hard-headed acknowledgement that we sent that force away, woefully prepared, and they paid the price for our national neglect of defence. Amongst those who went ashore on the 25th of April and right through that campaign were some very fine soldiers. But just as in any army, in any war, some failed, some lost their nerve, they shunned combat, or they made professional errors. It is an inevitable aspect of war, which serious armies rigorously analyse and seek to improve on. Conversely, others of a different ideological persuasion lament our involvement in every war other than that concerned the immediate defence of Australia in the Pacific War of 1942 to 1945. And even then there is a small clique that thinks that we forced Japan into that war as well, an idea so daft only the poorest student of history could believe it. They invoke a version of what I recently saw referred to as the alienated poetic view of war espoused in the poems of Sassoon and Owen and other anti-war poems, that war is not only brutal but futile. To these critics, the band continues to play Waltzing Matilda down to the key, as our soldiers cannot make any ethical case for their sacrifice. Rather, our soldiers are invariably dupes of the global capitalist and imperialist systems. They sleepwalk off to other people's wars. They die for obscure reasons. This portrays them as victims without the volition to volunteer for a cause. As a foreign policy realist, I have even less sympathy for that calumny than the natural soldier nonsense. If one strand provides a coherence to every one of our foreign military commitments, it is this. We have deployed naval, military and air forces to support a benign global order which best reflects our values and aspirations as a liberal democracy wherever that order is imperilled. Now, at the risk of sounding like Jack Nicholson's Colonel Nathan Jessup in the film A Few Good Men, conferences like this one are held exclusively in societies which have developed a human rights framework under the blanket of the security provided by the great liberal democratic maritime powers of the last 3 centuries, Great Britain and the United States. We convene today because men, and in increasing numbers women, stand on the frontiers of the world in which human rights are both enforceable and must be defended. The ideals of the Enlightenment have flourished under maritime supremacy of those 2 great liberal maritime powers. Indeed, since the 7-Year War concluded in 1763, some combination of those powers have been willing to fight to prevent Europe falling under the sway of any rising continentalist militarist power. Both global conflagrations of the 20th century conform to this schema, with landlocked Germany seeking to achieve hegemony in Europe. And I am unequivocal in asserting that we were on the right side both times in those wars, both for idealistic and pragmatic reasons. As a prosperous, medium-sized power, inextricably linked to the global trading system and reliant for our very survival on the freedom of the global commons, we have always sided with the dominant liberal democratic power of the day. Australia could never secure its own sea lanes, even if we distorted our economy by adopting a permanent war footing on defence expenditure. We have flourished amidst a global order for which we could never have provided for ourselves. The deployment of our forces to the Dardanelles and to the Western Front, in my view, represented a clear-headed recognition that the defeat of Great Britain and France by Imperial Germany would have had grave consequences for Australia. I should hope that I do not need to labour that point as to the worthiness of our war aims against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Rather than providing cannon fodder for Etonian fops to squander or guileless lambs to the slaughter, the Anzacs, like every Australian expeditionary military contingencies, served our national interest by fighting for the preservation of a rules-based international order. On a day devoted to the advancement of human rights, I also believe it is essential to treat the Anzacs as human beings. Only by standing in their shoes and looking at the world through their eyes can we truly comprehend their motives. I believe that my analysis of our strategic history is correct, but every one of those soldiers who embarked for exotic lands in 1915 arrived at a deeply personal decision. It's ahistorical and demeaning of them as human beings to project our values and motives onto them. Firstly, they were overwhelmingly empire men. A significant number had either been born in the United Kingdom or had kinfolk there. They inhabited a world in which duty to the crown and the empire were both honourable and instinctive impulses. Moreover, they were citizens of a new country. Fears about invasion and security loomed large in their minds. Indeed, the quest for common defence was one of the primary motives of those who formed our Commonwealth in 1901. On Anzac Day this year, I stood on the battlements of a fort built in 1890 on Thursday Island in the Torres Straits by the Government of Queensland to deter Russian incursions. Our first casualties of the Great War did not occur in Gallipoli, but rather much closer to home, when a joint amphibious task force seized the German radio station at Rabaul, right on our doorstep. To me, these inescapable realities highlight the intellectual poverty of the emotive arguments both from the left and right about Anzac, the Great War, and indeed about Australia at war in general. War is a ghastly business, make no mistake. As Douglas MacArthur observed in his final oration, soldiers know this only too well because they suffer the deepest privations of any war. But war has also been the engine of human history. And as Clausewitz has noted, policy often advances behind an armed phalanx. Acknowledging the truth of this gives me no joy. But the most basic human right is the right to physical security and safety. And sadly, even in this sophisticated world of the 20th century, soldiers more often provide it than do jurists. And on that contentious note, I will cease. Thank you very much.